He came to the mountains to outrun memories, but the mountains had memories of their own. Elias Thorne had learned this truth in the slow turning of the seasons, in the way the wind carried the scent of pine and decay, a constant reminder that everything ended and everything was recorded. The land held its stories in the rings of trees and the strata of rock, a language he was only just beginning to understand. It was a quieter language than the one that screamed in his head during the long hours before dawn, the one that spoke of sand and heat, and a choice he could never unmake. His sanctuary was a small, rented cabin nestled deep in a valley that few people had reason to visit. It was flanked by aspens that trembled with every breeze, their leaves turning to coins of burnished gold in the autumn light. A creek, cold and clear, cut a path through the property, its constant murmur a substitute for the conversations he no longer had. He had come here seeking silence, but what he found was a different kind of sound, a low thrum of existence that was both more profound and more demanding than the noise of the world he'd left behind. Elias was a man carved from discipline and regret. In his early 40s, his body was still the lean, hard-wired instrument it had been in the teens, but his face told a different story. It was a landscape of its own, weathered by sun and worry, with lines around his eyes that weren't from smiling. He moved with an economy born of years of training, a quiet, deliberate presence that seemed to take up less space than it should. His uniform was constant, a faded olive M65 field jacket, regardless of the weather, a plaid flannel shirt, soft with wear, drab cargo pants and leather boots that had molded to his feet over 1,000 miles of unforgiving terrain. On his wrist, a military-issue watch ticked off the seconds of a life he now measured in sunrises and wood smoke. He was not alone. With him always was Bodhi, a German shepherd of advanced years, whose muzzle had gone from black to a distinguished silver gray. Bodhi was not a pet. He was a partner, a fellow veteran of a different, more instinctual war. The dog had served 3 tours as a multi-purpose canine, and his retirement was as restless as Elias's. He rarely barked. He moved with the same quiet purpose as the man, his amber eyes missing nothing. He was an early warning system, a moral compass, and the sole keeper of Elias's unspoken confessions. Their days fell into a simple, monastic rhythm. A pre-dawn check of the perimeter, a long hike into the national forest that bordered the property, the quiet labor of chopping wood or maintaining their meager gear. Elias was rebuilding himself, or perhaps just trying to hold the pieces together. The Eberly stock half-track pack he carried on their hikes was always loaded with more than was necessary. Water, a trauma kit, survival gear, a compass. It was a habit, a physical manifestation of the vigilance he couldn't switch off. He was always prepared for a mission that would never come. It was on one of these hikes, on a day when the air was crisp with the promise of the first true cold snap, that the rhythm broke. They were exploring a disused logging road that snaked up the western ridge, a trail not marked on any of his topographical maps. The path was overgrown, reclaimed by ferns and ambitious saplings. Bodhi, as always, was a few yards ahead, his gait smooth and efficient, his nose working the tapestry of scents woven into the air. Then, he stopped. It was not the pause of a dog catching a new scent, of a rabbit darting into the undergrowth. It was a complete and total cessation of movement. His body went rigid, a statue of coiled muscle and honed instinct. His head was cocked, his ears swiveling like small radar dishes, and a low, almost inaudible vibration started deep in his chest. It was a sound Elias had not heard since a dusty marketplace in Kandahar. A sound that meant something was fundamentally, structurally wrong with the world in front of them. Elias froze, his hand dropping instinctively to the folding knife clipped to his pocket, a useless but comforting gesture. He scanned the dense woods, his eyes tracing the patterns of light and shadow, looking for the shape of a bear, a mountain lion, the telltale outline of something that did not belong. He saw nothing. He heard nothing but the soughing of the wind in the pines and the frantic beat of his own heart. "Bodhi," he said, his voice a low rasp. "Easy, boy. What is it?" The dog did not relax. He took a single stiff step forward, then another. He was not moving toward a threat, but being pulled by an invisible line. His focus was absolute, fixed on a point somewhere beyond a thick stand of fir trees just off the trail. The low growl in his chest never ceased, but it was not aggressive. It was a sound of deep, profound disturbance. It was a sound of protest. Elias trusted the dog more than he trusted his own eyes. Bodhi had saved his life twice, not by fighting, but by listening to the world in a way humans had forgotten. If Bodhi said there was something wrong, there was something wrong. Elias unslung his pack, letting it drop silently to the pine needle-covered ground. He moved forward, matching the dog's deliberate pace, his boots making no sound. The air grew colder as they pushed through the low-hanging branches of the firs, the temperature dropping by several degrees as if they had crossed a physical threshold. And then he saw it. It was an RV, a vintage Nomad from the late 70s, its once white shell now a mottled canvas of rust, grime, and faded green paint that had been crudely applied in an attempt at camouflage. It was tilted at a precarious angle. Its front wheels sunk deep into the soft earth, as if it had tried to crawl into the forest to die and had not quite made it. A thick web of vines snaked up its sides, anchoring it to the landscape. It was a ghost, a forgotten relic swallowed by the patient, inexorable hunger of the woods. It shouldn't have been there. No vehicle could have navigated the overgrown logging road in at least 20 years. Bodhi stopped at the edge of the small, unnatural clearing, about 20 feet from the RV's decaying door. He sat, his posture ramrod straight, his gaze fixed on the vehicle. He whined, a high, thin sound of distress that cut Elias to the core. It was a plea. He was refusing to go any closer, but he was also refusing to leave. He had planted himself, a furry, gray-muzzled sentinel guarding a tomb or a secret, and he was not going to be moved. Elias felt a cold dread snake its way up his spine, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. It was the feeling of a mission starting. The unwelcome pull of a world he had tried so desperately to abandon. He looked from the implacable stillness of his dog to the silent, decaying hulk of the RV. The mountain had held its breath, and in the sudden, profound quiet, Elias knew his exile was over. Something had found him, even here. The silence around the RV was heavy, a physical weight on the air. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of the deep woods, but the dead, insulated silence of a sealed room. Bodhi remained at his post, a living statue of dissent, his amber eyes never leaving the corroded metal shell. His refusal was absolute, a silent command that Elias could not ignore. The dog was telling him two things at once. Danger, do not approach, and danger, do not leave. Elias walked a slow, deliberate circle around the clearing, his senses on high alert. He was reading the ground, the trees, the air itself. The RV was tilted, its axles broken or buried. The tires were long since rotted away, the wheel rims resting on flattened rubber husks. This vehicle hadn't moved under its own power in decades. The crude camouflage paint was flaking, revealing patches of the original factory white beneath. It was an amateur job, done in a hurry. The intent was not to blend in with the forest, but to disappear from a road, from a searching eye. He noticed small details his training had conditioned him to see. The branches of the surrounding trees were not broken. They had grown around the RV, enveloping it. The vehicle hadn't crashed here. It had been parked,
intentionally, and then time and nature had done the rest. He found a faint trail, almost completely erased, leading away from the back of the RV, heading deeper into the wilderness. A path of escape, or a path to nowhere. He returned to Bodhi's side, crouching down to run a hand along the dog's tense back.
The muscles were knotted, vibrating with a low-frequency anxiety. "What do you see, buddy?" Elias murmured, his gaze following the dog's. "What's in there?" Bodhi whined again, a soft, guttural sound, and nudged Elias's hand with his nose. It was a gesture of trust, but also of warning. "Be careful." Elias stood up, his decision made. He couldn't leave this. He couldn't walk away, not with the dog in this state. Bodhi's instincts were an extension of his own, a part of his own soul that was still connected to the primal truths of the world. To ignore the dog would be to ignore himself. He approached the RV with caution. The door was slightly ajar, held in place by a snarl of rust and a thick, woody vine. He placed his hand on the cold metal and pushed. The groan of protesting hinges was a scream in the stillness. The door resisted, then gave way with a final shuddering sigh, swinging inward into darkness. A wave of stale, cold air washed over him. It was a smell of contained time, of dust and damp, and the faint chemical scent of old plastic and decaying paper. It was the smell of a place that had been sealed not for years, but for a lifetime. He pulled a small, powerful flashlight from a pouch on his belt, the beam cutting a sharp white cone into the gloom. The interior was a wreck, but an organized wreck. It looked as if someone had left in a hurry, but had expected to return. A metal thermos lay on its side on a small formica countertop, a dark stain of long evaporated coffee beneath it. A stack of paperback books sat on a small shelf, their covers faded, their pages warped by moisture. A wool blanket was folded neatly on a narrow bunk at the rear. But it was the main table that drew his attention. It had been converted into a workspace. Maps were pinned to the wall, topographical charts of the very area he now stood in. Red and black lines crisscrossed the landscape, denoting boundaries and survey points that were different from the official versions he owned. In the center of the table, held down by a heavy glass ashtray, was a single, leather-bound journal. He moved deeper inside, the floorboards groaning under his weight. The air was thick, and he could feel the pressure change as he disturbed the settled dust. He ran his light over the maps. They were meticulously detailed. Notes were scribbled in the margins in a tight, precise hand. Words like discrepancy, unrecorded easement, test site, and aquifer contamination appeared over and over. He reached for the journal, his fingers hesitating just before they touched the worn leather. This felt like a violation. He was an intruder in a story that had ended long ago. But Bodhi's rigid posture outside, the sheer wrongness of this place, pushed him forward. He picked up the journal. It felt heavy in his hand, weighted with more than just paper and ink. He opened it to the first page. The handwriting was the same as the notes on the maps. The first entry was dated September 14th, 1982. "They think I've run," the entry began. "They think I'm scared. I am scared, but I'm not running. I'm hiding. There's a difference. You can't fight what you can't see, and they have become very good at being invisible. But I have their records. I have the proof. This valley isn't empty. It's full of secrets they buried, and I'm going to dig them up." Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. He flipped through the pages. They were filled with dense, detailed entries. Dates, times, names, chemical formulas, land parcel numbers. It was the work of a man obsessed, a man hunting a truth so large and dangerous he had to leave the world to do it. Then, his light caught something else,
tucked into a small, open cabinet above the table.
It was a series of audio cassette tapes, each one neatly labeled with a date and a name. He pulled one out. Marianne Caldwell, October 3rd, 1982. He ran his thumb over the small plastic rectangle. This was more than just a journal. This was a collection of testimony, evidence. A faint sound from outside made him spin around, his heart lurching into his throat. It was just Bodhi, shifting his position, his claws scraping on a rock. The dog was still there, still watching, still waiting. Elias moved to the back of the RV, to the neatly folded blanket on the bunk. He hesitated, then pulled it back. Underneath, there was nothing but the thin mattress. But he noticed the wood paneling behind the bunk seemed newer than the rest, the varnish a slightly different shade. He ran his fingers along the edge and found a small, almost invisible seam. Using the tip of his knife, he pried it open. It wasn't a panel. It was a door to a hidden compartment. Inside, nestled in a bed of yellowing foam padding, was a professional-grade tape recorder and a single, unlabeled cassette. Next to it lay a small velvet bag. Elias pulled the bag out and loosened the drawstring. He tipped its contents into his palm. It was a collection of soil and rock samples, each one in a tiny, labeled plastic bag. And at the bottom of the bag, something else. A small, heavy object. It was a bronze medal, the kind given for military service. He turned it over. On the back, an inscription was faintly visible beneath the patina of age. For valor, Corporal Frank Miller, Vietnam, 1969. Elias stared at the name. Miller. It felt familiar, but he couldn't place it. He looked from the medal to the tape recorder, to the journal on the table. The story of this place was beginning to take shape, a ghost rising from the dust. A journalist, a whistleblower, hiding in the woods, collecting evidence of a corporate crime. And a veteran, Frank Miller, somehow involved. He went back to the table and flipped to the last entry in the journal. The handwriting was different, shakier, more urgent. The date was almost a month after the previous one. Frank is gone. He went for supplies 3 days ago. He should have been back by now. The first snow is falling. I saw headlights on the old access road last night where there should be no headlights. They know I'm here. Or they know Frank is. I'm leaving the tapes. I'm leaving this journal. I'm taking the samples and heading for the rendezvous point on foot. If I don't make it, this is my testimony. My name is Daniel Crow. I was a reporter. And I'm sorry. Elias closed the journal. Daniel Crow. Frank Miller. 2 men who had vanished into this forest 40 years ago. One a reporter, the other a soldier. He looked around the small, cramped space. It wasn't just a vehicle. It was a time capsule, a tombstone. The final, defiant act of a man who had tried to tell the truth and had been swallowed by the silence. He stepped out of the RV, blinking in the afternoon light. Bodhi was still there, sitting patiently. The dog looked at him, then at the RV, and then back at him, a clear question in his eyes. Now do you understand? Elias knelt and showed the bronze medal to the dog. Bodhi sniffed it once, a soft puff of air from his nostrils, and then looked away, his duty done. He had brought Elias to the place. He had made him look. The rest was up to the man. Elias stood up and looked back at the decaying nomad. The weight of its story settled on his shoulders, heavier than his pack, heavier than the memories he had carried into these mountains. This was not a memory. This was present tense. A 40-year-old crime that felt as fresh as the cold air in his lungs. He had come here to be left alone, to absolve himself of responsibility. But responsibility had found him, in a rusted-out RV,
led by a dog who knew that some things can never be truly buried.
He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he couldn't just walk away. He had to finish what Daniel Crow had started. The journey back to his cabin was a silent one. The weight of the journal and the bronze medal in his pack seemed to alter his center of gravity. Bodhi trotted beside him now, no longer scouting ahead, his presence a steady, reassuring pressure against Elias's leg. The dog's anxiety had vanished, replaced by a quiet watchfulness. He had passed the burden to Elias, and his trust was a heavy, tangible thing. Back in the Spartan confines of his cabin, Elias laid the artifacts out on his simple wooden table. The leather-bound journal, the cassette tape labeled Mary Ann Caldwell, the unlabeled tape from the hidden compartment, and the tarnished bronze medal. The objects seemed to hum with a latent energy, disrupting the hard-won peace of his sanctuary. He built a fire in the hearth, not for warmth, but for the light and the life it offered against the encroaching dusk. He needed context. He needed to understand the lines on the maps and the names in the journal. His first instinct, the one honed by years in the field, was to handle it himself, to operate alone. But this was a different kind of mission. This wasn't about breaching and clearing. It was about unearthing and proving. He needed help. The nearest town was a place called Aspen Ridge, a small community that clung to the highway 20 miles down the mountain. It was a town that survived on a trickle of tourists and the quiet persistence of its long-term residents. He'd only been there a handful of times, for supplies, keeping his interactions brief and functional. Now, he would have to engage, to ask questions, to become visible. The next morning, he drove his old pickup truck down the winding mountain roads. Bodhi sat in the passenger seat, his head held high, looking for all the world like a dog who had just given his human a very important and time-sensitive task. Elias found the humor in it dry and fleeting. The dog's imagined judgment was a familiar companion. He probably thought Elias was driving too slow. Aspen Ridge was waking up. Steam rose from the diner's chimney, and a few locals were exchanging pleasantries outside the post office. Elias felt like a foreigner, his quiet, solitary existence a stark contrast to the small-town interconnectedness on display. He was looking for the county records office, a place he'd only seen on a map. He found it in a small, unassuming brick building next to the fire station. The sign above the door read, Clear Creek County Clerk and Recorder. Inside, the air smelled of old paper, floor polish, and weak coffee. A tall, spare woman in her late 50s or early 60s stood behind a high wooden counter, sorting mail. She had sharp, intelligent eyes and graying hair pulled back in a severe but practical bun. She wore a Forest Service green shirt and a no-nonsense expression. This was, he surmised, the gatekeeper. She looked up as he entered, her gaze sweeping over him, taking in the worn jacket, the disciplined posture, the faint air of trouble he seemed to carry. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice neutral but not unkind. "I'm looking for old survey maps," Elias said, his voice rusty from disuse. "And property records, from the late 70s, early 80s. The woman, whose nameplate identified her as Sarah Jenkins, county clerk, raised a skeptical eyebrow. "That's a broad request. This isn't a library. What parcel are you interested in?" Elias hesitated. He couldn't exactly give her the coordinates of a hidden illegal campsite. "The area west of the old Black Creek logging trail, up on the ridge." Jenkins's expression sharpened. "Not much up there. Hasn't been for 40 years. Mostly national forest, with a few old mining claims that reverted to the state. Why the interest?" He needed to give her something, a piece of the truth. "I found something. An old vehicle. Looks like it's been there a long time. I'm trying to figure out who it belonged to." She studied him for a long moment,
her eyes seeming to see more than he was showing. She saw the veteran in his stance, the caution in his eyes. Vehicle abatement falls under the sheriff's department, but if it's on Forest Service land, that's ranger business. I used to be a ranger. Her tone was a subtle test, a way of establishing her authority and her knowledge of the land he was trespassing on.
I understand, Elias said. I'm not looking to report it, not yet. I'm trying to understand it. He reached into his jacket pocket and placed the bronze medal on the counter. This was inside. Sarah Jenkins picked up the medal. She turned it over, her thumb rubbing away some of the grime over the inscription. Her face softened, just for a second. Frank Miller, she read aloud, her voice barely a whisper. She looked up at Elias, a new light in her eyes. It was respect. My father served in Vietnam. This means something. She put the medal down gently. The plat maps from that era are in the archives. They're fragile. You'll have to look at them here. And you'll have to be more specific about the area. Elias took a gamble. He pulled the journal from his pack and opened it to one of the hand-drawn maps Daniel Crow had made. He pointed to a specific section, marked with a red circle. Here. Jenkins leaned over the counter, her eyes narrowing as she studied the drawing. That's the old Argentum mine claim. It was owned by a big mining conglomerate back east, a company called Geocore Dynamics. They did some exploratory drilling in the 70s and then declared the site unviable. Sold the land rights to a timber company in '83, but the deal was messy. The whole area has been tied up in litigation and environmental impact studies ever since. Geocore Dynamics. The name felt cold, corporate, and powerful. Is Geocore still around? Under a different name. They rebranded in the 90s. They're called Apex Consolidated now. One of the biggest development firms in the state, she said, her tone laced with a distinct lack of admiration. I'll get you the maps. Give me a few minutes. While she was gone, Elias felt a presence behind him. He didn't turn. Shouldn't you be in a university, Eris? Not lurking in a county clerk's office. A dry chuckle answered him. And shouldn't you be communing with squirrels, big brother? I got your message. Sounded urgent. And cryptic. My favorite combination. Elias turned to face his younger brother. Dr. Eris Thorne was a study in contrasts to Elias. Where Elias was weathered and hard-edged, Eris was academic and slightly rumpled. He wore a tweed jacket over a faded university sweatshirt, and his eyes, the same shade of blue as Elias's, were framed by glasses that were perpetually sliding down his nose. He was a history professor at the State University, a man who dealt in the dead and their documents. He was also the only person Elias had trusted enough to call. The message had been simple. Aspen Ridge, County Clerk's Office, noon. It's about a story you'll want to hear. What are you doing here? Elias asked, a genuine question. I was in the middle of cataloging 18th century land grants. A process only slightly less exciting than watching paint dry. Your text was a welcome reprieve, Eris said, his eyes already fixed on the journal on the counter. Is that it? Is that the story? Before Elias could answer, Sarah Jenkins returned, carrying a large rolled-up tube of heavy paper. She spread a massive yellowed map across a wide table. The ink was faded, the paper brittle at the edges. This is the official survey from 1980, she said. Eris was instantly captivated. He leaned over the map, his fingers tracing the faint blue lines of waterways. Beautiful. This is a GLO plat. Look at the calligraphy on the surveyor's notes. Elias pointed to the section he'd shown Jenkins from Crow's journal. This area here, Geocore Dynamics owned it. Eris's academic curiosity sharpened into professional focus. Geocore, yes, I know the name.
They were notorious in the 70s and 80s. They'd use legal loopholes to acquire mineral rights on public lands, do exploratory drilling that bordered on environmental sabotage, and then declare bankruptcy or sell off the assets to a shell corporation before the EPA could catch up with them. They poisoned more than one watershed in this state. Elias felt the pieces clicking into place. Daniel Crowe wasn't just chasing a story about a land grab. He was investigating environmental crimes.
He opened the journal for his brother to see. A reporter named Daniel Crowe was looking into them in 1982. He disappeared. Eris began to read the journal, his movements becoming faster, more agitated as he turned the pages. My God, Elias, this is a meticulous record of corporate malfeasance. He's got dates, names, internal memos he must have gotten from a source inside the company. He's documenting them illegally dumping chemical waste from their drilling operations directly into the old mine shafts. Sarah Jenkins, who had been listening intently, spoke up. The old Argentum mine sits directly on top of the Black Creek Aquifer. That aquifer provides water for half the valley. The full gravity of the secret hit them all in that moment. It wasn't just about stolen land. It was about poisoned water. A crime that would have sickened generations. He had tapes, Elias said, his voice low. Interviews. He looked at Eris. I need to hear what's on them. I have one of the tapes, but the RV didn't have a player that worked. I have a portable deck in my car, Eris said, already turning to leave. For my oral history projects. Old habits die hard, thankfully. While Eris was gone, Elias turned to Sarah Jenkins. Frank Miller, he said, tapping the metal. Any idea who he was? Jenkins's face was grim. I remember the name. Not him personally, I was just a kid. But my dad used to talk about him. Frank Miller came back from the war and couldn't settle. He worked odd jobs, mostly as a hunting guide. Knew these mountains better than anyone. He had a reputation for being a bit of a recluse, but honorable. He and his wife, Mary Ann, lived in a small cabin just outside of town. Then, one day, they were just gone. The official story was they packed up and moved to Oregon, but there were whispers. Mary Ann Caldwell, the name on the cassette tape. Frank Miller's wife. Eris returned with a small, professional-grade cassette player and a set of headphones. The three of them huddled around the counter, a strange and sudden team forged in the dust of a 40-year-old mystery. Elias carefully inserted the tape labeled with Mary Ann's name. Eris pressed play. After a few seconds of hiss, a woman's voice filled the small office. It was hesitant at first, then stronger, filled with a quiet, steely anger. They came with papers, said it was a government survey, said we had to let them drill test wells on our property. Frank knew it wasn't right. He'd seen the company's name on the side of the truck, Geocor. He warned me not to drink the water from the well anymore, to only use the spring-fed cistern. Elias watched Sarah Jenkins's face as the tape played. Her expression hardened into a mask of cold fury. This wasn't a historical curiosity for her. This was her home, her father's friends, her water. The interview continued. Mary Ann describing how their livestock had gotten sick, how her husband had started doing his own research, talking to other ranchers, collecting samples. He met a reporter from Denver, a man named Crowe. Frank trusted him. He gave him everything he had found. He said Mr. Crowe was going to make it right. The tape ended abruptly. Eris rewound it, his face pale. She was the whistleblower's source. Frank Miller wasn't just a guide. He was the key. He was feeding Crowe the ground truth. Elias's mind was racing. Frank and Mary Ann disappear. Daniel Crowe disappears. The story is buried. Geocore sells the land and rebrands, escaping justice. He looked at the second tape, the unlabeled one from the hidden compartment. The last piece. "Play the other one," Sarah said, her voice tight. Elias switched the cassettes. This one was different. The sound quality was poorer, filled with the sound of wind and what sounded like an engine idling. A man's voice, rough and panicked, was speaking. It was Daniel Crow. "Headlights on the road. It's them. Frank's not back. I have to assume the worst. I'm recording this on Frank's machine. I'm leaving it in the compartment he built, the one they won't find. The samples are with me. The real proof is in the water. I'm heading for the old trapper's cabin by the falls. If anyone finds this, tell my wife I love her. And don't let them get away with it. Don't let them poison this valley." The recording ended with a sharp click, followed by the sound of a door slamming shut, and then silence. The profound, final silence of the forest. No one spoke for a full minute. The weight of Daniel Crow's last words hung in the air, a 40-year-old plea for justice. Elias felt the ghost of his own past failure rising in his throat. He had once chosen a mission over a man. Here was a man who had chosen his mission, the truth, and had paid the ultimate price. The two stories twisted together in his mind, a double helix of duty and regret. Sarah Jenkins was the first to move. She walked over to a locked filing cabinet and pulled out a key. In 1983, there was a flash flood that washed out the old Black Creek Bridge, she said, her back to them. A car was found in the ravine, registered to a Daniel Crow. The official report said it was an accident. The body was never recovered. She pulled out a thick, dusty file. And in the fall of 1982, the sheriff's department received an anonymous tip about the Millers. Said they'd packed up and left in the middle of the night. Their cabin was empty, but the neighbors said they left their dog behind. Frank Miller would never have left his dog. She slapped the file down on the counter. "I was a teenager. I remember people talking. I remember thinking it was all wrong. But no one did anything. The whispers died down. Geocore was a powerful company. People were afraid." She looked directly at Elias, her eyes blazing with a cold fire. "It seems they still are." Elias knew what she meant. He had seen the name of Geocore's successor, Apex Consolidated. He had seen their billboards along the interstate, advertising luxury mountain developments and exclusive golf communities. They were no longer just a mining company. They were shaping the future of this state, paving over its past. "What do you want to do?" Eris asked him, his voice low. Elias looked at the evidence spread before him. The journal, the tapes, the maps. He looked at the determined face of Sarah Jenkins and the worried, loyal face of his brother. He thought of Bodie waiting for him in the truck, the dog who had started it all, who had sensed the lingering injustice in the soil. He picked up Frank Miller's medal and closed his hand around it. The metal was cool against his skin. It felt like a promise. "I'm going back up there," Elias said. "There's more to this." Crow mentioned samples. He was taking them to a rendezvous point, a trapper's cabin by the falls. "The old Blackwood Falls cabin," Sarah said immediately. "It's on the far side of the ridge. It's a hard trek, but it's still there." "Then that's where I'm going," Elias said. It wasn't a choice anymore. It was a directive, issued by a ghost and confirmed by his own conscience. He was no longer running from his past. He was running towards someone else's. The drive back to his cabin felt different. The mountains no longer seemed like a refuge, but a witness. The silence was no longer peaceful, but expectant. As he pulled up to the cabin, a sleek black SUV that was conspicuously out of place sat parked in his driveway.
A man in a tailored suit, looking utterly incongruous against the rustic backdrop, was standing on his porch, admiring the view.
Bodie, from his seat in the truck, let out a low, guttural growl, the same sound he had made near the RV. It was the sound of a threat identified. The man on the porch turned, a polite, predatory smile spreading across his face. He was in his late 40s, with silvering hair and the confident, easy posture of a man accustomed to being in charge. "Mr. Thorne," he called out, his voice smooth and reasonable. "I was hoping I might have a word. My name is Harrison Finch." Elias got out of the truck, moving slowly, deliberately. He didn't open Bodie's door. The dog's low growl was a constant, steady hum, a baseline of menace. "You're on private property," Elias said, his voice flat. Finch's smile didn't waver. "My apologies. I'm with Apex Consolidated. We're in the process of acquiring a large parcel of land in this area for a new development project, the Aspen Ridge Preserve. You may have heard of it." His tone was casual, but his eyes were sharp, analytical. They were scanning Elias, the cabin, the truck, assessing. "I haven't," Elias said. "Well, it's a wonderful project. Very eco-friendly," Finch said, the words sliding off his tongue like oil. "During our preliminary surveys, one of our drone teams flagged an anomaly on an adjacent property, an old, abandoned vehicle. Our records show that this particular slice of land, while technically part of the National Forest, is under a long-standing reclamation claim by our firm, dating back to our predecessor company, GeoCore Dynamics." The name hung in the air between them, a declaration of war disguised as a historical footnote. "We're legally obligated to perform a reclamation," Finch continued, his voice a masterclass in calm authority. "That means removing any and all debris, including the vehicle you seem to have found. Our team is scheduled to begin work tomorrow morning. I just wanted to give you a courtesy heads up, as a neighbor." It was a threat, wrapped in the language of corporate procedure. They knew he'd found the RV. They weren't just here for the land. They were here for the secret. The drone team was a lie. They had been watching him. "That vehicle has been there for 40 years, Elias said. "What's the hurry?" Finch's smile tightened almost imperceptibly at the edges. "Progress, Mr. Thorne. Progress waits for no man. It's just an old piece of junk, a minor eyesore, hardly worth anyone's time or concern. I'm sure you agree." He was feeding Elias the official story, testing him to see if he would swallow it. Elias thought of the journal, of Daniel Crow's last words, of Frank Miller's medal. He thought of the poisoned water. He looked at this well-dressed man who used words like reclamation and debris to describe a man's tomb and his life's work. "I found a journal inside," Elias said, the words dropping like stones into the quiet afternoon. "And some tapes." For the first time, a flicker of something other than polite condescension crossed Finch's face. It was annoyance, a flash of cold, hard anger, quickly suppressed. He had misjudged his target. "Ah," Finch said, recovering smoothly. "Personal effects. How unfortunate. Of course, any such items our team recovers will be turned over to the proper authorities for archival. They are, after all, technically the property of Apex Consolidated, as they were found on land to which we hold the claim. It's all very straightforward, legally speaking." He was trying to neutralize the evidence, to absorb it into the black hole of corporate bureaucracy. He was telling Elias that whatever he had found, it belonged to them now. "I don't think Daniel Crow would agree," Elias said quietly. Finch's face went blank. The polished mask fell away, revealing the cold, pragmatic core of the man beneath. The smile was gone. "Mr. Thorne," he said, his voice now devoid of its false warmth. "You are a man who clearly values his privacy. You've come to a remote place to be left alone. I understand that, and I respect it. I would strongly advise you to continue valuing that privacy. Some things from the past are best left buried, for everyone's sake. He was offering a deal. Silence for silence. Walk away, and we'll let you keep your isolated peace. Interfere, and we will take it from you. From inside the truck, Bodhi's growl deepened, escalating into a low, rumbling threat that vibrated through the cab. It was a clear, unambiguous judgment. Finch heard it. He glanced at the truck, his eyes narrowing. He was not a man who liked dogs. Or perhaps he just didn't like dogs he couldn't control. "A veteran, I hear," Finch said, his gaze returning to Elias. "Special Forces. A man who understands the importance of following orders, of knowing when a mission is over." It was a deliberate, calculated probe, aimed at an old wound. Finch had done his homework. He knew who Elias was. Elias felt a cold rage building inside him, a feeling he had worked so hard to bury. This man was using his past, his pain, as a weapon against him. "This mission isn't over," Elias said, his voice low and steady. Finch held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded, a small, sharp movement of his head. "A pity," he said. He turned and walked back to his SUV, his movements crisp and efficient. He didn't look back. As the SUV pulled away, spitting gravel, Elias let Bodhi out of the truck. The dog came and stood beside him, pressing against his leg, a warm, solid anchor in a world that had suddenly become unstable. Elias put his hand on the dog's head, feeling the fierce, unwavering loyalty there. The confrontation was over, but the war had just been declared. Finch wasn't just going to remove the RV, he was going to obliterate it and the truth it contained. And he would do it tomorrow. Elias looked up at the western ridge where the sun was beginning to set. The trapper's cabin. The samples. He was running out of time. The polite threat had been delivered. The escalation was coming. The night was long and restless. Elias didn't sleep. He sat by the fire with Bodhi at his feet, cleaning his gear with meticulous, practiced motions. It was a ritual of preparation, a way of calming the storm inside him. He laid out the topographical map Sarah Jenkins had given him, tracing the route to Blackwood Falls with his finger. It was a treacherous path, 10 miles of steep inclines and rock-strewn ravines, but it was the only way. He had called Eris after Finch left. A brief, clipped conversation. "They know. They're moving tomorrow morning." "I'll call Jenkins," Eris had replied, his voice tight with urgency. "She can try to get a temporary injunction, but against a company like Apex, it's a long shot. They'll bury us in paperwork. You need to find those samples, Elias. They're the only thing that can't be dismissed as hearsay." As dawn broke, painting the sky in shades of gray and bruised purple, Elias was already packed. The journal and tapes were sealed in waterproof bags, nestled deep in his Eberly stock pack. He left a note for Eris on the table, along with the keys to his truck. "If I'm not back in 24 hours, give this to Jenkins." Tucked under the note was the unlabeled tape, Daniel Crow's last will and testament. He was splitting up the evidence, a tactical decision. Don't keep all your assets in one basket. He and Bodhi set off just as the first light touched the peaks. The air was cold and heavy with moisture. A storm was rolling in from the west, a dark wall of clouds that seemed to mirror the darkness of Finch's intentions. It was a race against time, against the corporation, against the weather. The hike was brutal. The trail to the falls was even more overgrown than the logging road, a faint memory on the forest floor. Bodhi, despite his age, moved with a renewed sense of purpose, his nose to the ground, occasionally glancing back to make sure Elias was keeping up. The dog knew the stakes. By midday, the storm broke. The sky opened up, and a cold, driving rain began to fall, turning the already difficult trail into a slick, muddy trench. The wind howled through the trees, tearing at Elias's jacket, its roar of physical force. Every gust felt like an argument, a reason to turn back. It was in the middle of a steep, rocky ascent that it happened. Elias was navigating a narrow ledge, his boots searching for purchase on the slick granite, when a sudden, violent gust of wind slammed into him. He lost his footing, his feet sliding out from under him. He twisted as he fell, trying to protect his pack, and felt a searing pain in his left knee. He landed hard in a tangle of wet brush, the impact jarring his teeth. For a moment he lay there, the rain soaking him to the bone, the pain in his knee a white-hot flare. He tried to push himself up, but his leg buckled, sending another wave of agony through him. Bodhi was instantly at his side, whining, licking his face, his warm breath a stark contrast to the cold rain. The dog was frantic, torn between his duty to protect and his inability to help. "I'm okay, boy," Elias grunted, though he knew it was a lie. He gritted his teeth and managed to sit up. He examined his knee. It was already swelling, the fabric of his cargo pants tight against the skin. He could put some weight on it, but not much. He was miles from anywhere. The storm was getting worse, and he was injured. The memory hit him then, unbidden and sharp as shrapnel. The dust, the blinding sun, the smell of cordite. The voice of his radio man crackling in his ear. "Bravo 6, this is Bravo 2. Sanders is down. I repeat, Sanders is hit bad. We're pinned down." And his own voice, cold and distant, issuing the order that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "Negative, Bravo 2. We press the objective. Maintain mission focus." He had chosen the mission over his man. He had secured the intel, a laptop with target data, and left his friend behind in the crossfire. By the time they went back for him, it was too late. The intel had been valuable, they told him. It saved lives, they said. But it hadn't saved Sanders. He looked at Bodhi, who was now sitting patiently in the rain, watching him, his eyes filled with an unwavering trust. The dog was his responsibility, his partner. He could try to press on, to hobble his way to the cabin, but in this weather, with this injury, he would be putting them both at risk. Or he could turn back, admit defeat, and let Finch win. Let the past repeat itself. And then a third option materialized, a whisper of old training. Improvise, adapt, overcome. He couldn't go forward, and he couldn't go back, but he could stay. He could make a stand. From the ledge where he had fallen, he had a clear line of sight down the mountainside, back toward the area where the RV was hidden. It was a perfect overwatch position. He was a sniper without a rifle, a guardian without a weapon. But he had the high ground. "All right, boy," he said to Bodhi, his voice filled with a new, hard resolve. "Change of plans. We're holding this position." He found a small rock outcropping that offered some meager protection from the wind and rain. Working through the pain, he used his knife to cut splints from a fallen branch and fashioned a crude brace for his knee. He laid out his survival gear, a thermal blanket, his fire-starting kit, the last of his water. He and Bodhi huddled together under the overhanging rock, a small island of warmth and defiance in the raging storm. Hours passed. The rain turned to sleet, and the world dissolved into a gray, churning chaos. Elias kept his focus on the valley below, his eyes scanning the logging road, waiting. He shared his last energy bar with Bodhi, breaking off pieces and feeding them to the dog, who took them gently, his gaze never leaving his master's face. It was late in the afternoon when he saw them. 2 heavy-duty pickup trucks and a flatbed carrying a large industrial crane, their headlights cutting yellow swaths through the gloom. Finch's reclamation team. They were moving in, using the cover of the storm, assuming no one would be foolish enough to be out in it. Elias watched them approach the turnoff to the RV, his hand resting on Bodhi's head. The dog didn't growl. He was perfectly still, perfectly silent, conserving his energy, mirroring Elias's own focused calm. The trucks disappeared into the trees, but Elias could hear the distant, ugly sound of their engines and the snapping of branches. They were forcing their way through. He could imagine the scene. Men in bright yellow rain slickers, their faces grim, just doing a job. He saw Finch directing them, his tailored suit now likely replaced with expensive all-weather gear. Then, the crane started its engine, a deep, guttural roar that echoed up the mountain. They were going to do it. They were going to rip the RV from the earth and erase Daniel Crow's last stand from history. Elias felt a surge of helpless rage. He was too far away, too injured to stop them. He had failed. Again. Suddenly, Bodhi stiffened. He lifted his head, his ears perked, and let out a single, sharp bark. It wasn't a warning. It was a signal. Down below, near the hidden clearing, a figure emerged from the trees. A man in a rain-soaked work jacket. He was one of Finch's crew. He stood for a moment looking up the mountain. Then he turned and began walking back toward the crane, moving with a strange, hesitant gait. Elias watched, his breath held. What was happening? The man reached the crane. He spoke to the operator. There was an argument, gestures. Then the man from the woods climbed into the cab of the crane. The original operator climbed out, shaking his head, and went to one of a group of men huddled under a tarp. He was pointing back at the crane, then up the mountain. The crane's engine revved, and the boom began to swing. But it wasn't moving toward the RV. It was swinging wildly, clumsily, back and forth, its heavy steel hook narrowly missing the other trucks. It was chaos. A man was shouting. It looked like an accident, a piece of equipment gone haywire. Finch appeared, his face a mask of fury, screaming at the man in the cab. But the man just sat there, his hands on the controls, shaking his head. And then Elias understood. It wasn't an accident. It was sabotage, a deliberate act of defiance, the conflicted insider. He looked closer at the man who had first emerged from the woods, the one who had taken over the crane. He was a younger man, with a military bearing even under the bulky work clothes. As he turned his head, Elias caught a glimpse of his profile. He looked like the faded photograph of a young soldier. He looked like Frank Miller. It had to be his son, or his grandson, a man who had grown up with the Whispers, who knew the story of his family's disappearance, a man who had taken a job with the enemy, waiting for a chance to do the right thing. Bodhi's bark hadn't been for Elias. It had been for him, a signal that the time was now. The chaos below escalated. Finch was on his phone, likely calling for security, for the police, for anyone who could restore his control. But control was lost. The accident had bought them time, precious time. Just then, another set of headlights appeared on the logging road. A Forest Service truck, followed by a county sheriff's vehicle, their lights flashing, cutting through the sleet. Sarah Jenkins and Eris. They had gotten the injunction, or they had come anyway, armed with the truth and the authority of the law. Finch saw them coming. He threw his hands up in disgust, a gesture of pure frustration. His perfectly planned operation, executed under the cover of a storm, had unraveled because of an injured man, an old dog, and the conscience of a single worker. Elias leaned back against the cold rock, the tension draining out of him, leaving him weak and trembling. He looked down at Bodhi. The dog was licking his hand, his tail giving a slow, steady thump against the wet ground. He had done it. He had stayed. He had chosen the man, the dog, over the mission. And in doing so, he had accomplished the mission. He hadn't abandoned his partner. He had trusted him. And that had made all the difference. The storm was passing. A sliver of pale light broke through the clouds in the west, illuminating the valley. Elias looked at his watch. The second hand was still ticking, measuring out the seconds of his life. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was moving with them, not against them. The weight on his shoulders was still there, but it was no longer the weight of regret. It was the weight of a promise kept. The morning after the storm was unnaturally quiet. The air, scrubbed clean by the rain, was sharp and cold, and the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. From his rock ledge, Elias had watched the official proceedings unfold below. Sarah Jenkins's arrival had been decisive. She had served Finch with a court order, a temporary restraining order based on Eris's emergency petition, citing potential evidence in a 40-year-old cold case. Finch had argued, his voice carrying on the still air, but the authority was no longer his. The sheriff's deputies had secured the scene, their quiet, professional presence a stark contrast to the corporate bluster of Finch's crew. Finch and his men were gone now, escorted off the mountain. The RV, which had been on the verge of destruction, now sat under official protection, surrounded by yellow crime scene tape that fluttered in the breeze. It looked less like a wreck and more like a monument. Eris and a deputy found him just after sunrise. Eris took one look at Elias's leg and his face, etched with pain and exhaustion, and his academic demeanor dissolved into fraternal concern. "Elias, my God, we need to get you down from here." The descent was slow and painful. Elias leaned heavily on his brother and the young deputy. Every step a fresh argument from his knee. Bodhi stayed close, a furry, four-legged honor guard, nudging Elias's hand whenever he faltered. When they reached the clearing, Sarah Jenkins was waiting. She had a thermos of hot coffee that tasted like the best thing Elias had ever drunk. She looked at his leg, then at him, her expression a mixture of respect and exasperation. "You know, for a man who wants to be left alone, you cause a remarkable amount of trouble." "It seems to find me," Elias admitted. "The worker who stalled the crane," Sarah said, getting straight to the point. "His name is Miller, Jake Miller. He's Frank Miller's grandson. His family moved to Oregon after Frank and Mary Ann disappeared, but the story was never forgotten. He said he took the job with Apex's subcontractor, hoping he might find something, some proof of what happened to his grandparents. When he saw our trucks coming, he knew it was his chance." "Is he in trouble?" Elias asked. Sarah shook her head. "His statement is being taken. He's a witness, not a suspect. He said he was inspecting the crane for safety violations he'd noticed earlier. Apex won't be able to touch him." There was a glint of satisfaction in her eye. As for Finch, Apex Consolidated has already released a statement. They're shocked and appalled by the actions of a rogue employee. They've placed Harrison Finch on indefinite leave and are promising full cooperation with the investigation. "They're cutting him loose," Eris said, disgust in his voice. "Sacrificing a pawn to protect the king." "Maybe," Sarah said. "But this time the story is out. The Denver papers have already picked it up. A 40-year-old mystery, a whistleblower, a shadowy corporation. They'll dig, and with Daniel Crow's journal and tapes and whatever else we find here, they'll have a lot to dig for." Elias looked over at the RV. It seemed smaller in the daylight, more fragile. A team of forensic specialists was beginning the slow, careful work of dismantling it, not as debris, but as evidence. They were treating it with the reverence of archaeologists excavating a pharaoh's tomb. "We found the trapper's cabin," Sarah continued, her voice softer. Just where you said it would be. We had a team fly in by helicopter this morning. She paused, and her gaze met Elias's. They found him, Elias. Daniel Crow. He never made it to the cabin. It looks like he fell into a ravine not far from it. The cold preserved him, and his pack. The samples were still there, sealed in their bags. The news landed with a quiet finality. The mission was over. Daniel Crow's last run had finally reached its end. He would be going home. What happens now? Elias asked, the question feeling heavy and strange on his tongue. He was used to the clear-cut end of a mission. Extract, debrief, forget. This was different. Now, Eris said, putting a hand on his shoulder. We get you to a doctor, and then we let the system do its work. For once. The next few weeks were a blur of doctors, physical therapy, and quiet observation from the porch of his cabin. His knee was a serious injury, a torn ligament that would require surgery and a long recovery. The mountains he had once roamed with ease were now, for a time, beyond his reach. He was grounded. But the isolation felt different now. It was no longer a self-imposed exile, but a necessary convalescence. The world he had tried to shut out kept finding its way to his door. Sarah Jenkins stopped by regularly with files and updates, sitting on his porch, sharing coffee and case notes. Eris drove up from the university every weekend, ostensibly to help out, but mostly to argue with Elias about history and politics, filling the quiet cabin with a life and energy it hadn't known. One afternoon, a dusty sedan he didn't recognize pulled into his driveway. An older man, his face a road map of care and time, got out. It was Jake Miller. He held a small, cloth-wrapped object in his hands. He approached the porch cautiously. Mr. Thorne? Elias, he corrected. Have a seat. Miller sat, his hands twisting the cloth bundle in his lap. I wanted to thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. For not walking away. My family, we've been waiting a long time for someone to listen. Your grandfather and Daniel Crow did the hard part, Elias said. I just read the map. They're bringing them home, Miller said quietly. My grandparents, they found them, buried on the old GeoCorp property, not far from the mine. It wasn't an accident. It was an execution. He paused, swallowing hard. The state is pressing murder charges. They're trying to trace the command structure at GeoCorp back in '82. Finch is talking, trying to save himself. He's giving them names. The truth, buried for 40 years, was finally coming into the light. My family wanted you to have this, Miller said, handing Elias the bundle. Elias unwrapped it. It was a compass, old and heavy, its brass casing warm from Miller's hands. It was a military Lensatic compass, the same model Elias had trained with. It was my grandfather's, Miller explained, from Vietnam. He used it to guide people through these mountains. My grandmother said he could always find his way. We thought you should have it. You're the one who brought him home. You showed everyone the way. Elias closed his hand around the compass. It felt like an anchor, a responsibility, not a burden, but a purpose. Thank you, he said, the words feeling inadequate. After Miller left, Elias sat on the porch, the compass in his hand, Bodhi's head resting on his good knee. He looked out at the mountains, at the familiar lines of the ridges and the endless expanse of trees. The landscape hadn't changed, but he had. He had come here to lose himself, but instead, he had found a piece of himself he thought was long dead. The part that connects, the part that protects, the part that stays. He looked at his reflection in the glass of the compass. The face that looked back was still his, still marked by the past, but the haunted look in the eyes was gone, replaced by something else, something like peace. He no longer measured his life in the missions he had completed or the failures he had endured. He measured it in the steady presence of the dog at his side, in the unexpected warmth of his brother's company, in the trust of a woman like Sarah Jenkins, and the gratitude of a man like Jake Miller. The silence of the mountains returned, but it was a different silence now. It was not the absence of noise, but the presence of peace. A quiet earned, not by running, but by standing still, by choosing to stay. Bodhi sighed, a deep, contented sound, and settled his head more firmly on Elias's lap. The sun was warm on their faces. The watch on Elias's wrist ticked on, but for the first time, he wasn't counting the seconds. He was living in them. He was home. The first snow of the season came early that year, a soft, silent blanket that covered the scars on the land and offered a clean slate. Elias watched it fall from his porch, a mug of hot coffee warming his hands. His knee was healing, the sharp pain dulling to a persistent ache, a physical reminder of the choice he had made on the mountain. It was a good pain. Bodhi lay by the fire inside, his dreams punctuated by the occasional twitch of a paw or a soft woof. The old dog seemed more at ease than Elias had ever seen him, the vigilant sentinel finally, truly, off duty. He had done his job. He had found the broken piece of the world and led his human to it, trusting that he would know how to make it right. The story of Geocore and the Aspen Ridge Valley had become a statewide sensation, then a national one.
Apex Consolidated, buried under an avalanche of lawsuits and catastrophic public relations, had been forced to establish a massive victims' compensation and environmental cleanup fund. The land around the old Argentum mine was declared a state-protected wilderness area named the Crow-Miller Memorial Preserve. Justice, it turned out, was not just about punishing the guilty. It was about healing the land and remembering the lost. Aris had become something of a media darling, the historian who helped crack the cold case. He handled it with a self-deprecating grace that made Elias unexpectedly proud. His brother, the man who lived in the past, had helped to change the future. Their bond, once stretched thin by distance and trauma, had been reforged in the crucible of the mystery, and it was now stronger than ever. Sarah Jenkins had been promoted, offered a high-level job with the State Parks Department. She had turned it down. "My work is here," she had told Elias, her gaze sweeping over the valley. "Someone has to stand watch." Elias understood. He was standing watch too. He hadn't left. The thought had occurred to him, once his leg was strong enough to travel. He could go anywhere, find a new place to be alone. But the urge was gone. Leaving felt like running again, and he was done with running. He had found a reason to stay. He had taken a volunteer position with the county's search and rescue team. His skills, once used in distant, violent lands, were now being put to use finding lost hikers and helping people caught in the sudden, fierce mountain storms. He was still a guardian, still a protector, but his mission was no longer dictated by a chain of command. It was dictated by the needs of his community, by the simple human contract of helping a neighbor. He picked up the old brass compass Jake Miller had given him. He held it in his palm, its weight familiar and comforting. It didn't point north anymore, not for him. It pointed home. It pointed to a purpose. It pointed to the man he was becoming rather than the man he had been. The past was not gone. The ghosts were still there. The memory of Sanders, of the choice he had made in the dust and the heat, would always be a part of him. But it no longer had the power to break him. It was a scar, not a wound. A reminder of the cost of a lesson hard learned. He had failed a man once by choosing the mission.
On the mountain, in the storm, he had been given a second chance. A chance to choose the man, the partner, the living soul beside him. And in saving Bodhi, in choosing to stay with his companion, he had, in some small, quiet way, finally saved himself. He looked out at the snow-covered peaks, their majesty both humbling and inspiring. The mountains still held their memories, their stories of time and geology, of survival and decay. But now, he was a part of that story.
A small footnote in the long, epic tale of the valley. The veteran who came seeking silence and found a voice. The man who, with his old, faithful dog, had listened to the whispers of the past and refused to let them fade away. Bodhi padded out onto the porch, his claws making soft clicking sounds on the wood. He nudged Elias's hand, his amber eyes looking up, full of a deep, knowing calm. Elias smiled, a genuine, easy smile that reached his eyes. "I know, boy," he said, rubbing the dog's graying head. "I know. It's a good day." The snow fell, the fire crackled, and in the small cabin nestled in the heart of the valley, a man and his dog sat in the quiet, earned peace of a life reclaimed. The compass lay on the table, its needle steady. They were where they were supposed to be. They were home.